Welcome and thank you for joining us. Our topic today is again faith-based diplomacy, a field of soft power diplomacy most effectively conducted by and on behalf of Israel. We are honored to have with us two outstanding guests, Yossi Klein Halevi, a leading practitioner of religious outreach, speaking to us from Jerusalem, and Professor Yaakov Ariel, who, not only in my estimation, is the preeminent historian of Christian Zionism in all its broad sweep. Professor Ariel, we welcome you from North Carolina.
Thank you.
Before introducing each of you further, I'll introduce myself. My name is Philip Earl Steele, and I'm a scholar of Christian Zionism, whose honor it is to represent the 3Cs Association based here in Warsaw. In November next month, right around the corner, we're launching a new foreign affairs journal, one of the main focuses of which will be faith-based diplomacy, how to apply that in Polish relations with the United States. This is the second webinar in our four-part series on Israeli faith-based diplomacy, particularly on relations with Christian evangelicals, but not only. I now wish to turn to our guests. First to you, Professor Ariel. I'd like you to speak first. Professor Yaakov Ariel of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill teaches at the Department of Religious Studies there. Professor Ariel's book, entitled, at the top of my stack, mind you, An Unusual Relationship, Evangelical Christians and Jews, is the outstanding synthesis, the finest comprehensive work on the unusual relationship. And as very many of my friends and colleagues can attest, your book, Professor, is the one I most eagerly recommend. So my first question then, Yaakov. Do please describe for us the broad sweep of the unusual relationship, focusing, of course, on the side of Christian Zionism, which, after all, developed clear political ambitions in the first half of the 19th century and reaches all the way back, of course, to the Reformation. So if you would give us that, again, that broad sweep of the question then, please.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for introducing me so generously. And you're right. The book tries to be a comprehensive synthesis of evangelical relationship with Jews, of the rather long history and variegated history of evangelical engagement with Jews. It shows that this is not something new or something that just developed really in the last decades, but it has a long history. It starts in some ways with the Reformation, with the renewed interest, if you will, or even in some ways new interests in the Jews and in the Holy Land. It starts with renewed interest in the sacred scriptures, the growing importance in Protestant circles of the Bible, the translations of the Bible. Martin Luther's engagement with the Jews and his hope for Jewish conversions. In some ways, you can say that he was the first Protestant missionary to the Jews, and that he wished to see a renewal and gathering of the Jews. Although, as Luther is a good example, this doesn't mean that the old baggage that European Christian developed for hundreds of years regarding Jews, who they are, what they are as people, as individuals, disappeared. We see a renewed interest, even stronger interest, with the Reformed tradition. Talking now about major trends in Protestant Christianity. And the Reformed tradition, much more so than the Lutheran Reformation or the Magisterial Reformation, took special interest in the Old Testament. saw the Old Testament not just as a prelude to the New Testament, but as a codex that has its own importance and can provide inspiration for the relationship between a Christian community and God. And Reformed Protestants were the center of Christianity, both Puritans in England and New England, Dutch Reformed, who show actual, not just interest in the Jews, not just wish to see the Jews return to the center of history, but that saw the Jews as heirs and continuers of biblical Israel, object of biblical prophecies, and took interest in the possibility of Jewish return to Palestine and the creation of a Jewish commonwealth there as a prelude to the arrival or the return of the Messiah. You could see that with Reform interest and engaging with the Jewish messianic movement surrounding Shabtai Tzvi in the mid 17th century, and even attempts in the British Parliament to suggest that the English Parliament, that England would finance the transfer of Jews, the transportation of Jews to Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
This is perhaps the first instance that we see an attempt on behalf of what we could call early Christian Zionists to come with actual plans of support for the recreation of a Jewish commonwealth in the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, in the ancient Holy Land. We see a systematic interest motivated by messianic hopes of the pietists in the late 17th century and throughout the 18th century and 19th century in Jews and the Holy Land, the first attempt to build a corpus of literature for Christians, for Jews, and to create meeting places between Christian and Jews. My emphasis in the book is that it's not just about politics, or rather that politics is not divorced from theological and cultural enterprises and perceptions. Those people are viewing the Jews as players in the cosmic drama of salvation. They see the Jews as about to return to their ancient place and role as God's first nation. It's the nation that would be central to the arrival of the Messiah and to the Messianic era, and that is about to renew its covenant and its, I would call it, political presence in the Holy Land. In fact, I would make the claim that the first Zionists, if they need to define the term, if you define the term as a Jewish movement, you limit, I think, the role and place of Christians in the rise and creation of the Zionist movement. But I don't think that there would have been a Zionist movement, and I don't think that it would have been as successful and would have accomplished what it has accomplished just with Jews, with no Christian support, with no Christian contribution, with no Christian, not just political support, but I would say also moral support. The fact that Christians, that there were Christians around, including influential Christians. Those are not just marginal people. If this was a marginal movement, it would have been like the Radical Reformation, the left wing of the Reformation. That didn't have any political effect, certainly not on the Zionism and the Middle East. We're talking here about Jews that are aware of the presence of Christian supporters, are encouraged by Christian supporters. In fact, Zionism took off the ground when both Jews and Christians were willing to cooperate, come together, and support each other towards what you could call not a mutual goal, because each of those groups have its own agenda, its own hopes, and its own motivation, but through, I would say, what is at least partially, a mutual endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
And I emphasize in my book that in order to understand Christian Zionism, you cannot just look at the politics, you cannot just look at the White House. You need to look at thousands of books that were written from the 17th century onwards, sometimes earlier, but certainly from the 17th century. We have corpus of Puritans writing about Jews and their national revival, eventual national revival. We have pietists. Evangelicalism comes on the scene in the late 18th century, but it becomes a major cultural, religious, and even political movement in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. You mentioned correctly political initiatives already in the 19th century that did not come from the margins of English society or British society by that time. Lord Ashley Cooper, the seventh Earl of Shaftesbury, that came in 1840 with a plan for establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, was no other than the son of the British foreign minister. Mm-hmm. And the leader of the Evangelical Party in England at the height of the political and cultural influence of evangelicalism in British society. Mm-hmm. Later on, as the 19th century progresses, particularly after the Civil War, evangelicalism is strong all over the English-speaking world, including in America, but in the later decade of the 19th century, it becomes messianically oriented in ways that are very similar to British evangelicalism and to Pietism. And if you want to go back in some ways also to Puritanism. And then Americans come with Zionist initiatives before the rise of political Zionism and have sometimes a hard time dragging the Jews into their hopes and schemes. It's only when there is a Jewish Zionist movement that comes on the scene, we start to see in the early 20th century, we see late 19th century with Herzl, and in the 19th century, particularly towards the Balfour Declaration of 1917, we see cooperation between Zionist leaders and Christian leaders, very often behind the scene. Mm-hmm. I should emphasize here that at that time, it wasn't just ardent, evangelical, messianically oriented Christian leaders that joined in, or those were the people that showed leadership and initiative, but they managed at that time to bring in Christian leaders who were not necessarily premillennialist, eschatologically oriented as themselves, but were willing to accept the merit of the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine on humanitarian grounds, on political grounds, on economic grounds. And amazingly, to give you one example that is just amazing because of the change of attitude, the Presbyterian Church USA, that today is very skeptical about Israel and its policies, in 1916 and 17, it passed a resolution in favor of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, one of the very early such Christian resolutions. And it was willing to support a petition to the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who was a member of the church, asking him to back such initiatives. This would not have happened if it was just for political maneuvers. There's a whole cultural background to that. Presbyterians there were at that time Presbyterians who were eschatologically oriented. There were at that time also Presbyterians who were not. The denomination by the 1920s would be at war between the modernists and the fundamentalists. But at that time, you could pass such a resolution in the late teens and be willing to make it known to the president. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is the relationship between evangelicals and Jews has long historical roots, goes all the way back to the Reformation, has moments and groups that have been particularly involved, Puritans, pietists more so even, German pietists, not all the pietists, just as not all the evangelicals. When we come to today, we'll talk about that. And evangelicals already, when they come on the ground in strong presence in the 19th century for sure, it has also, it's much more variegated and large than just political maneuvers. Literature, journals, intensive missionary work, because until Christian Zionism could materialize into a movement that cooperates with and works with the Jews on a political level, the only way for evangelical Christians, pietist Christians, to relate to the Jews, to influence the Jews, to influence the course of Jewish history, to educate the Jews as to their actual role and purpose in history, was via the mission that was not just about converting Jews in the narrow sense, make Jews Christians. It was about educating Jews. It was about disseminating ideas and faith and hopes among Jews. It was also about creating a meeting ground between the two faiths and two communities, and creating even, ultimately, what I would call a borderline religious, literary, intellectual, cultural area, because there would be both Christians, thousands of them will be engaged in such work, in such writings, in such interactions. There would be tens of thousands of Jews who, although converting to Christianity in the sense that they accepted the evangelical faith theologically, faith in Jesus as Messiah and personal Savior, they would still be intellectually, socially, culturally engaged with Judaism, and would see themselves as Jews working in Christian society on behalf of the importance of the Jews in history and the importance of Christians showing positive attitudes towards Jews. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, the political consequences, the political engagement is an outcome of theological outlooks, is an outcome of massive literary production and cultural engagement. Mm-hmm. It's an outcome of the creation of hundreds of institutions throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, created by pietist and evangelical Christians in order to be engaged with the Jews. Mm-hmm. On street corners, in missionary houses, in visiting homes, but also in hospitals and clinics, and English classes for immigrants, and in enormous literary exchange.
Mm-hmm. A bottom-up movement. Your book, Yaakov, published in 2013 by New York University Press. That was 7 years ago already, and assuming that you're working on a second edition, I'd like to ask you, what would you describe in the new chapters you would add to your book? After all, so very much has happened in these last 7 years regarding Israeli evangelical relations.
Absolutely. I would say that the evangelical Jewish relationship is full of paradoxes. Nobody would have expected what is perceived as a very conservative Christian group to be engaged so passionately with nationalist Jews, with Jewish national endeavors and Jewish return to the center of history, And there is from people looking at the evangelical world without really realizing what evangelical theology and infrastructure is about, can find it just amazing. There are, incidentally, amazing moments. Speaking about the last 7 years, there are those evangelicals who would never go into a winery in California. Evangelicals won't go into wineries. They won't establish wineries, they won't work in wineries, and they very often would not drink alcohol of any kind. And if they do, it's something that they would not celebrate or emphasize. But we have today volunteers, conservative evangelical volunteers, as I see Yossi Halevi knows, who volunteer by the hundreds to help settlers in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, plant and grow and send produce to wineries, and you can see pictures of such conservative Christians working in and for wineries in the West Bank. So there are many, many moments that seem like beyond belief. But the last 7 years saw, therefore, what I would call a paradox, or even reaching some, I would say, radical moments or situations. On the one hand, you can say that as far as actual policies towards Israel are concerned, seemingly at least, they have reached a peak in the White House willing to make gestures, cater to the wishes of evangelical Christians, messianically oriented, politically conservative in relation to Israel. And we saw that very clearly with such moves, controversial, daring, whatever you'd like to call them, as opening an embassy in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
There've been a consulate. There have been an embassy in Tel Aviv, but the embassy is now in Jerusalem itself, the official capital of Israel. But of course, this is very controversial because for long years, most countries would not establish their embassies in Israel, as Yossi Halevi will tell us. And the Palestinians claim Jerusalem too as their capital. And the borders or arrangements have not been settled. So on the one hand, you can see, wow, this president is catering, is tuned to and willing to make decisions along, I would say, conservative evangelical lines.
Clearly.
That seeing the evangelicals as the base, as the central base of his constituency, of his supporters. But at the same time, this is not the peak necessarily of evangelical Jewish relationship, not even on the political level. There have been presidents before who were strongly influenced by a Christian evangelical biblical faith. This goes all the way back to President Wilson, who was very careful, incidentally, not to let the American public at large know where his sentiments were, but we happen to know them. This goes all the way back to Harry Truman. We can argue about that, who later on called himself Cyrus. I'm Cyrus. When he visited the JTS, when celebrating 300 years of Jewish presence in America in 1953, or I think it was, or 4. You can correct me on that. This goes all the way back to Lyndon Johnson, whom Abba Evan describes when he met him, when he was still a senator that he spoke about Israel in biblical terms.
Mm-hmm.
And we can point to other presidents, or if not presidents, political leaders. Jesse Helms from my very own North Carolina would be another example, a conservative, a born-again evangelical Christian who, as the head of the head in the Senate of a committee that had to make decisions about money and support internationally, saw in Israel an exception. The Israelis were willing to support. But at the same time that we see this amazing, here there is a president influenced by evangelicals, or wishing to appease evangelicals, or wishing to let evangelicals know that some at least of their wishes are respected, and move the embassy to Jerusalem. At the very same time, I would say that other things happen too. I would say two things happen. First of all, there is, according to some polls, a decrease, not increase, in the number of evangelicals in America. There is what you could call moderate demographic crisis. Evangelicalism is not at its height necessarily in the American public arena.
Mm-hmm.
B, which I think is even more important to Israeli evangelicals' relationships, evangelicals are not all made of one cloth. And there have been also erosions in evangelical circles in their relation to Israel. Mm-hmm. Some groups of evangelicals, ironically again, many of them from the Reformed tradition, are not enthusiastic about Israel today. This has been going on for a while, but it's very clear in the last 7 years. And I would say that what we see in the last years is that the relationship between evangelicals and the Jewish state, if you want to call it Zionism today, you can also call it perhaps that. I'm not sure would be the right term, but the relationship has become in many ways sectarian. That is, we see conservative, I'm generalizing, conservative, more radical, more right-wing evangelicals associating with right-wing, more conservative, more radical Jews in Israel. It's not a relationship that includes the liberal, progressive, quote-unquote left-wing, which is a very tricky term in Israel today. Left-wing in Israel very often means simply not seeing the idea of settlements favorably. The all-time left would tell you there's hardly any left-wing in Israel. Mm-hmm. Even the left-wing political parties are actually right-wing, neoliberal. Mm-hmm. But the Israeli, quote-unquote, that defines itself, the Israelis that define themselves as left-wing, anti-settlement, pluralistic in their outlook, mostly non-Orthodox, non-settlers favorite, they are not taking part in the evangelical Israeli menage. Mm-hmm. And likewise, large parts of American Christianity, including Protestant groups, including evangelical groups, mm-hmm. leaders, thinkers, are not necessarily always hostile towards Israel. Israel enjoys in America better, if you will, attitudes than it does in quite a few European countries, but that do not share the evangelical infatuation mm-hmm. with Israeli right-wing policies. Mm-hmm. And so, in some ways, you can say that the peak, seemingly the peak of evangelical influence on the White House in relation to Israel and in perhaps other issues too. See that if you want to, I'm not going to go into the Supreme Court nomination. That happens just when the position of many evangelical Christians towards Israel is much more, let's put it, much less enthusiastic, more critical. And in fact, I would go even one step further. Many Christian groups in America, thinkers, writers, are sometimes skeptical of Israel, more so than before, because conservative right-wing evangelicals support it, celebrate it, and influence the policies towards it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because within American Christianity, within American cultural and political streams, there are many who do not share evangelical views and attitudes and see them as way too radically right-wing or non-inclusive or non-supporters of an open, inclusive society.
Mm-hmm.
And so Israel,
excuse me.
And so Israel finds itself actually labeled and analyzed along anti-right-wing radical critique. Perhaps this happens for other reasons too, and from other quarters too, but the alignment with evangelicals has helped Israel some, but has also created further criticism and further reservations in many circles. It came at a price, in other words.
I have one last question, a rather long one this time, and I'm afraid I have to ask for a brief response, however. I think it's fair to say that until the 1950s, the general description of the history of Zionism was one that treated it as a British Jewish shared enterprise of some kind. I'm thinking especially of works by Nahum Sokowów, who was one of the most outstanding early Zionist leaders from here in Poland. He wrote fantastic works on the history of Zionism beginning immediately after World War I and later in the early 1930s. I'm thinking also of Franz Kobler, who shortly after the creation of the state, in the middle of the 1950s, wrote The Vision Was There. It too presented a picture of a shared British-Jewish enterprise. Over the next decades, however, that disappeared from the historiography. Jewish and Israeli writers tended to treat the whole enterprise as almost purely Jewish. And it wasn't until over the last 20 years, I guess, that the focus has returned to something like that of Sokowów and Kobler, presenting it as a shared sort of an enterprise. Nonetheless, despite the past 20 years where there's better balance in showing the partnership, it remains, as you call it in the title of your book, an unusual relationship and a largely unknown one, even in corners of Israeli society. And I wonder, why is that? I mean, it's been much more than an open secret. It's for all to see. The opening and closing comments at the ceremony in Jerusalem when the U.S. opened its new embassy there were made by evangelical pastors, after all. So it's there for all to see, and yet, Yaakov, why does it remain a mystery and an unknown to so many?
Well, first of all, it's much more known today than before, and Israelis and non-Israelis are much more aware of this relationship today than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. Nachum Sokolov was an exception. He was a Zionist leader and a writer who published a 2-volume history of Zionism early on, and included large portions on Christian involvement, support. This was unusual. If you read most books on Zionism, even today, by prominent Israeli historians or Jewish historians, they like to disregard the Christian vision, help, support, and credit the Jews only with the Zionist endeavor. I think it has to do with the idea we made it, it's, it's a Jewish state for Jews, of Jews, for Jews, by the Jews. My claim is this isn't the case. But I think that you're right, that on the whole, there's been a neglect, there's been concealment, there's been ignorance. I think this is part of a larger ignorance that Israelis and Jews in general are not experts on Christian theology. If you read or hear things that the Israeli leaders have said, you see that sometimes they don't know the difference between one group and another. Menachem Begin related to evangelical support, he says, the Christians support us. The idea that there are also Christians who don't support us and Christians who are even against his policies or his project escaped his mind. Mm-hmm. There were moments, I occasionally wrote about them, that are again even I would say funny almost. Ben-Gurion's lecture to the International Pentecostal Conference in Jerusalem in the early 1960s, mm-hmm. in which is, isn't it nice that Christians too understand that Israel is the kingdom of David, which of course for evangelical Christians, including Pentecostal, this is not the case at all. Nobody understood why are all those delegates sitting there with poker faces, not clapping hands and not nodding with their faces. They were sitting there politely, not booing, but of course not clapping hands. You can sometimes hear, even today, Israeli leaders or writers saying things that are just awkward. I always like to bring the writings of settlers in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, whatever you want to call it, who write pro-evangelical, pro-Christian Zionist articles, and are saying, you see, those people are they get it. They're with us. They totally get it. Unlike incidentally, secular liberal Jews or progressive Orthodox Jews who just don't get it. They see and understand, we have our messages and they're convincing to them that those are not exactly the same messages or the same vision or the same program, is something that I think sometimes they don't want to know, because they are supported. They're supported by Christians who don't fully share their vision, share it on some points, but not on others. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it. I hope that there is more realization, and there will be more realization on the nature of Christian Zionism and its role in the history of both Jewish Christian Zionism, because I don't think this is a one-sided Jewish endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And I hope the second edition of An Unusual Relationship will help that end. Thank you so much, Yaakov. Yossi Klein Halevi of the Shalom Hartman Institute is a very prominent Israeli intellectual whose books and articles and interviews are appreciated in Israel and across much of the world. Among Halevi's books are At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. That's from 2001. Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation from 2013, and more recently from 2018, letters to my Palestinian neighbor. Yossi, you're very, of course, energetically active in interfaith dialogue with Muslims. We mentioned before we began Imam Abdullah Antepli. You were recognized here in Poland just last year by the Polish Council of Christians and Jews as Man of the Year for your efforts regarding Polish-Jewish reconciliation. In your brand of faith-based diplomacy, I think we can call it that, you stress, and I quote you here, that a religious language applied to our conflict is essential for opening hearts, and that the language of the Spirit is at the core of the solution. Yossi, as a practitioner then of spiritual outreach, of faith-based diplomacy, please tell us at some length about your efforts, what inspires them, and what promise they hold for Israel's relations with its neighbors near in the Muslim world and far in the US.
So first of all, I just want to thank Professor Ariel for really just a terrific survey. And it was really a pleasure sitting and learning from you. In terms of the work I do with Muslims, it has really two components. The first is working with Palestinians here in the neighborhood. I live in Jerusalem, and I have relationships with Palestinians here in the city, in the West Bank, within Israel proper, Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And the second area of work that I do with Imam Abdullah Antepli, who is a neighbor of Professor Ariel's, he's head of Muslim affairs, Muslim studies at Duke University in North Carolina. There we have a project working with Muslim American leaders, teaching them the ways in which Jews understand their own identity, the interface between peoplehood, religion, nationality, sovereignty, land, ethnicity, all of these very complicated components of Jewish identity that Jews take for granted as intuitively as somehow fitting in, and I think is very difficult for outsiders to understand, especially Muslims, but Christians as well, in terms of the relationship between peoplehood and faith and how that plays out. So for example, one of the most difficult concepts for Muslims to understand about Jews is the phenomenon of the Jewish atheist. If Judaism is a religion, as is Islam and Christianity, if we are the three monotheistic faiths, then how can you have Jewish atheists who are still considered to be Jews in reasonably good standing by other Jews? Certainly, the most ultra-Orthodox Jews wouldn't imagine throwing out Jewish atheists from the Jewish people. They may consider them bad Jews, but they're still Jews. In Christianity and Islam, of course, if you stop believing in the dogma, you're no longer a Christian or a Jew. And Judaism works differently because we are peoplehood-based. We are a people with a religious identity. So I would say that in some ways is the most important point that we try to convey to young emerging Muslim American leaders who participate in the Hartman Institute program. And the purpose of the program, as defined by Imam Abdullah, is to enable emerging Muslim American leaders to have a better relationship with their American Jewish neighbors. And this is especially significant in the era of Trump, when the Muslim American community has felt increasingly besieged and was looking for allies within the Jewish community and in America generally, and found many allies in the Jewish community. But the issue of Muslim opposition to Israel continually undermines interfaith relations between Muslims and Jews. So the program was a Muslim initiative. It was initiated by Abdullah and Tepli to try to help Muslim American leaders better understand the place of Zionism and the state of Israel in Jewish identity, in American Jewish identity, to further their own local interfaith efforts. So in that sense, Israel was almost incidental. This wasn't about developing relations with Israel, but it was about understanding the significance of Israel for Muslim Americans, for American Jews, sorry. The work that I do with Palestinians and with people in the region, I'd say Arab journalists, other opinion makers, is very much an outgrowth of the work that I've been doing over the years with Abdullah, and that is an attempt to explain how Israeli Jews understand the meaning of home, why we believe this is home, why we came home. Zionism for Muslims, Zionism for Palestinians. And as you can imagine, Philip, that is the most difficult audience for to have this kind of conversation. And I felt after almost a decade of being involved in this outreach project with Muslim American leaders who really helped teach me a language for speaking about Israel and Zionism to Muslims, that it was time for me to reach out to my Palestinian neighbor and to try to, first of all, explain who we are, because the information that Palestinians get about Israel, Judaism, Jewish identity is unfortunately so skewed in Palestinian media, in other Palestinian frameworks. And that's true throughout the Middle East. There is no real appreciation for Jewish indigenousness in this land, for the fact that we were here 2,000 years ago. That is simply denied throughout the Middle East. It's a Zionist invention. The Bible is a Zionist invention. And so the work that I've been doing with Muslim Americans is something that I'm now trying to do here in the region. And my book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which you mentioned came out 2 years ago, was, I would say, the first attempt by an Israeli writer to appeal directly to our neighbors and to explain who we are and why we're here. And it's written very much from a religious perspective. And I think that for the purposes of this conversation, that seems to me really the key point. One of the many reasons that the Oslo process, the peace process of the 1990s, failed, I believe, is because it was an attempt by secular elites on both sides to bypass the deep reservoir of faith that exists certainly in Palestinian society, but also increasingly in Israeli society. Israel is certainly a much more secular society than Palestinian society. Nevertheless, even many so-called secular Israelis have a deep sense of Jewish tradition, have a deep connection to Jewish tradition. And that's part of the fluidity of peoplehood and faith. There are no rigid borders between secular Israelis, traditional and non-observant Israelis, Orthodox Israelis, and very Orthodox Israelis. I mean, the very Orthodox Israelis are in their own world, but all the other camps maintain a certain fluidity. And so the Oslo process tried to isolate religion, which it understandably saw as a problem, as a threat to the peace process, but my argument is that if religion, both Islam and Judaism, were sources of opposition to the peace agreement, which they were, most of the opposition on both sides came from the religious camp, then we needed to be doing even more deep work in our respective religious sources and in our religious communities to find those voices within the tradition and within our communities who were ready to consider making very painful concessions, even religious concessions, for the sake of peace. And I believe that those voices certainly exist in our traditions, and those voices exist within our communities. They need to be brought to the fore. And so what I'm trying to do in this project, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is initiate a faith-based conversation with Palestinians, with Arabs more broadly in the region. The book was translated into Arabic. It was placed online for free downloading, published in Arabic the same day it appeared in the US in English. I have a website in both English and Arabic, and hopefully soon in Hebrew. The book is about to come out in Hebrew. And my purpose was really to try to create a new language for peace that is not left-wing. Professor Ariel touched briefly on the decline and fall of the Israeli left, which is primarily secular, primarily Ashkenazi Jews of European origin. My language for peacemaking does not come from the secular left. I'm neither secular nor left-wing. I grew up on the right. That was my background, very much on the nationalist Zionist right, as far right as one could be when I was a teenager. It's going back now 50 years, but nevertheless, those are still my emotional roots in the Beitar youth movement, which was the most right-wing Zionist youth movement, and then even further right, without elaborating, but certainly that's where I come from. And so my instincts are still right-wing. And even if my politics has become very much centrist and very much pragmatic rather than nationalist, I have a deep resonance with nationalism, and I understand nationalism. I understand Palestinian nationalism. I understand Palestinian maximalism because I come from there. My own Zionism was territorially maximalist. All of the land between the river and the sea belongs to the Jewish people. Now, I still believe that in principle, but not in practice. And so the language that I'm trying to create for peacemaking is a very pragmatic language. It's a language that offers religious Israelis a familiar context, a language that validates faith on both sides, a language that is not trying to impose secular Western ideas of peacemaking on a region that is fundamentally resistant to those ideas. And I experienced that in the late 1990s when I was still in those years working as a journalist. I participated in a gathering of Palestinian and Israeli journalists on the island of Rhodes. There were about 200 journalists on both sides, and it was sponsored by UNESCO and the Europeans at that, and we had this fantastic rapport. By the end of these 3 days we spent together, we were literally dancing on the tables together to Greek music. And we came home and the whole thing fell apart. And all connections disintegrated. Partly it was because the Palestinian Authority imposed a threat of boycott on the Palestinian journalists who participated. But I think there was something deeper at work, because what I noticed when we were all together in the island of Rhodes, we were being cosmopolitans together. We weren't Muslims or Jews or Israelis and Palestinians. We were very worldly journalists. And so the Palestinian journalists were drinking wine, and the Israeli journalists were eating shrimp, and we were all being very worldly together. And then we returned to our little pressure cooker in the Middle East, and the whole thing falls apart. And so there was something artificial about an attempt with the best of intentions, this American and European attempt to encourage secular elites in both societies to bypass the religious minefields, admittedly minefields on both sides. But the work that I'm trying to do now is to go right into those minefields and to say there is no way to avoid religion. And I would go further and say that if we have the wisdom, we can discover the deep reservoirs of peace, of longings for peace in our traditions, our respective traditions, that we can apply to this conflict. So that's the project that I've been working on. And I'll give you one example. Really, this is in some ways one of my favorite responses that I received from the Palestinian side. A young man named Yusuf Bashir, who grew up in Gaza during the very difficult period of the Second Intifada, the time of the suicide bombings. And Yusuf Bashir wrote a terrific book called The Words of My Father, a beautiful and very powerful memoir. And he read my book and sent me a response. And what he says there is that when I read your words, he said, it was very difficult for me to read a book explaining Zionism. But when I read about your faith in God, and when I read that you're coming from a place of devotion and tradition, I was able for the first time in my life to hear an argument about Zionism. Mm-hmm. And this is someone from Gaza. And he now lives in the States, and we've become friends. And I've published a new addition to the book, a paperback edition, with an extensive epilogue of responses from Palestinians, and his letter is there. And it is by no means the only response like that I've gotten from Palestinians. The book has been reviewed in the Arab media. One of Saudi Arabia's leading news weeklies gave it a very good 2-page review. I got a better review in Saudi Arabia than I did in the New York Times, by far. And I actually think that there's something about this moment that's really interesting in that the Arab world's opposition to the legitimacy of a Jewish state is collapsing. Yeah. And we're seeing that with the peace agreements that Israel just signed with the United Emirates and Bahrain, which, by the way, I think are among the most significant events in the history of the state of Israel. And those who downplay the significance of it because they say we were never in direct conflict are missing two crucial points about these agreements. The first is that the oil states 50 years ago presented the single greatest strategic threat maybe in the history of the state of Israel. The Arab oil, certainly the single greatest diplomatic threat in the history of Israel. The Arab oil boycott, which was led by the Saudis and the Emirates, threatened to turn Israel into a pariah state. Western Europe turned against Israel in the 1970s because of the Arab oil boycott. all of Africa cut off relations, Black Africa, cut off relations with Israel because of the Arab oil boycott, because of the Saudis and the Emirates. Today, these are the same countries that are leading the move for normalization with Israel. And that's the second significant development with these agreements, which is that this is Israel's first peace agreement with any Arab country that is based not on a formal peace treaty alone, but on a deep longing for intimacy with Israel. Mm-hmm. We didn't experience it with Egypt, and we didn't experience it with Jordan. We are experiencing it now. And part of what's impelling this movement is faith. The Emirates are calling this the Abrahamic Agreement. And they are deliberately drawing on religious language. Now, I wouldn't call the Emirates the most religious countries in the Muslim world. And certainly what's really impelling this agreement is, first of all, fear, a shared Israeli-Arab fear of Iran. Mm-hmm. And secondly, a very strong economic impulse. We are the most successful countries. We're the only successful countries in the Middle East. There's the Emirates, the Saudis, and Israel, essentially. Mm. And I'm leaving Turkey and Iran out of the equation, but within the immediate region. And so this is really creating even though there are very pragmatic reasons for this peace, I think it's very significant that the Emirates felt a need to frame the peace within a religious justification, a religious language. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is really crucial for how we're going to have a breakthrough for peace in the region.
Well, you've led into my second question then Yossi. In 2017, Fathom Journal in the UK published a brilliant interview with you, one I passed on to literally everyone, the 6-Day War and Israeli society. In that interview, among a number of matters you clarified, you showed how it is that important political and historical events shape, sometimes drive, sometimes stifle the ambitions of religious communities. And so I want to ask then, how are such events shaping things today? And I admit you in part already answered this question. How are they shaping events regarding Israel's foreign relations as regards religious communities?
Well, look, the rise of political religious forces in Israel, I find highly problematic. I'm very worried about the growing power, political power, organized political power of the religious communities. And we're really talking about two communities: the ultra-Orthodox, who are primarily interested in maintaining their separatist religious communities, mm-hmm. and what we call the religious Zionists, who tend to be more modern, more part of mainstream Israel, but whose main political agenda is supporting the settlement movement. And I find both of those developments very worrying for Israel's ability to maintain its ability to remain a modern country. And I'm speaking strategically. I'm speaking from a place of security concerns. If we allow the ultra-Orthodox separatist phenomenon to expand, they are now about 13% of the Israeli public. Those numbers are growing exponentially. This is a community that is really expanding because of its great birth rate. And it's a community that feels very little connection to the mainstream. That's a tremendous drain economically on the country. And I'm very worried about the growth of the settlement movement, especially as the Arab world is finally opening up to Israel. A fear that haunts me is that just as the Arab world might be ready to embrace us, we could be missing that opportunity because of the growing strength of the settlement movement. And I don't think that that's the case at this moment, but I believe that in the end, we are going to have to reconcile with the Palestinians. We are going to have to come to terms with the Palestinian state, not only for their sake, for our sake as well. And the growing strength of the religious parties could be, on our side, the main stumbling block. On the Palestinian side, certainly, I don't believe that there is a Palestinian leadership that's prepared at this point to genuinely come to terms with a Jewish majority state in the Middle East. I don't think they're prepared to the trade-off of what I would call 1948 for 1967. We give up the territorial gains of 1967, which is the West Bank. Well, Gaza we've already given up, in exchange for Palestinian agreement to waive their demand for the return of the descendants of the refugees from 1948 to what is now the State of Israel, which is a non-starter for virtually any Israeli Jew. And so the conditions are not ripe yet. But if they ever do become ripe, I want to be sure that on our side, we're in a position to say yes, to move toward an agreement. And so I actually see domestic religious politics as a twofold threat to Israel's well-being.
Just briefly then, Yossi, my last question, circling back to Christian Zionism, to the phenomenon of Israeli evangelical relations, what sorts of threats do you see in the many aspects of that relationship over the upcoming?
Well, Professor Ariel raised one serious threat, which is the growing alienation among, I'd say, especially younger, less conservative evangelicals. That phenomenon is growing, and there are groups that are working to try to staunch that development. There's the Philos Project, for example. I've been involved with them. They're a terrific group. They're trying to create more of a nuanced evangelical voice so that your two options are not either being super pro-Israel, which means accepting the whole package deal, settlements, and right-wing Israeli politics, or left-wing anti-Zionism, which seem to be the two options at this point in the Protestant world generally. Which I find really inexplicable. This is why is it so hard for Protestants to show some nuance on this conflict? So the Philos Project is trying to take something of that middle ground, strong support and love for the State of Israel, grounded in evangelical faith, and at the same time an appreciation for the Palestinian counterclaim, the fact that there are two peoples in this land, both peoples need to be accommodated, and really trying to create a more, I would say, helpful and realistic evangelical politics on the region. So that's one piece of it. On the Jewish side, one of the great threats to the relationship is not coming from Israel, but from, I would say, progressive American Jewry, which abhors the evangelicals, abhors their politics, from abortions to Trump. They are on a collision course politically, and doesn't seem to really care one way or the other if the evangelicals are pro-Israel. I think it embarrasses them, if anything. And so that's been a major problem on our side of the dynamic. There are, I would say that on the Jewish side, there have been three sources of unease toward the evangelicals generally. And this is true politically and religiously across the board. The first is theological, a concern that evangelicals don't respect the integrity of Judaism on its own terms, that evangelicals are using Israel and Zionism for their own theology, which is certainly true, and I would say is legitimate. But the concern has been that the evangelical theology might actually conceal a very negative agenda toward Jews, a very apocalyptic agenda. So that was one concern. And I would say that that concern has been largely dealt with, certainly among Israelis, less so progressive American Jews, as we get to know evangelicals and realize that much of their theology is based more on the book of Genesis and not just on the book of Revelation. That it's really more, I will bless those who bless thee, and a desire to align themselves with God's will and love the Jewish people because God commands you to love the Jewish people. So I think more and more Israelis, including Orthodox Jews, get it. Not so much progressive American Jews. The second source of unease is an acute concern for missionizing. And here I would say that in Israel, evangelicals have lowered their missionizing profile. It hasn't disappeared completely. Where there is concern is with evangelical support for Messianic Jews, what is known colloquially as Jews for Jesus. And that continues. Messianic Jews certainly have a very strong place in the evangelical Hall of Fame. And this makes Jews very uncomfortable. The Catholic Church, after Vatican II, made a very strong disavowal of missionizing against the Jews on theological grounds. The evangelical world, by and large, hasn't done that, although you do have a few evangelical theologians who are starting to grapple with the need of evangelicals to respect Judaism on its own terms. And that if God really has a special relationship with the Jewish people and with Israel, maybe we shouldn't be trying to turn Jews into Christians. It's still unknown terrain for the most part, but I would say my sense is that this really is the next great area of Jewish evangelical dialogue. And the third area of concern is political, as I indicated earlier, especially for American Jews. The fact that Trump is so overwhelmingly detested by American Jews and so strongly supported by probably a majority of evangelicals, has created a tremendous divide, much less so than with Israelis. Israelis and American Jews tend to be on opposite sides politically. Strong majority of American Jews are Democrats. If Israelis could vote in American elections, overwhelming majority would vote Republican. I would say probably 70% of Israelis would vote Republican, and 70% of American Jews vote Democrat. So these are some sources of tension that I think, again, are more acute in the American Jewish evangelical relationship than they are today in the Israeli evangelical relationship. And as Professor Ariel indicated, the breakthrough really came with right-wing Israelis, who were initially the most suspicious of the evangelicals and are today the most passionate advocates of the relationship.
Yaakov, these are some of your most important specializations within this field of study, Messianic Jews and the relationship between Jews in the U.S. and the evangelical community there. Do you have any final comments to make?
Yeah, I do. I think I loved Yossi Halevi's presentation. I find it to be not only extremely intelligent and to really have knowledge, but also, I would say, a sensitivity to the opinions and feelings of different groups in the population. And I really admire the work you do of Muslim Jewish
Thank you. That admiration is very mutual, so thank you.
There's one place where I think we look at things slightly differently. I don't think that missions to the Jews in the evangelical camp and in the evangelical tradition are exactly the same as historical Catholic missions to the Jews, which were intended to bring Jews to become fully Catholic, including in, I would say, social, cultural, ethnic identity, right? You moved from one ethnic, social, cultural, linguistic group to another. I don't think that this is what exactly takes place in the evangelical community. I think that there, historically and for theological reasons, and the meaning of mission is different. This was the default manner for evangelicals to connect with the Jews, to be present in the Jewish neighborhoods, in Jewish society, to meet the Jews, to learn about the Jews. This goes all the way to pietists, who they didn't make too many converts, but there were dozens, hundreds of missionaries touring, visiting, encountering, writing about. In some ways, they were ambassadors, if you will, of one society, one culture, one theological framework, and religious tradition, among others, translating and reporting. I think today we see, including with what you rightly call Messianic Jews, we see that in some ways as an attempt to bridge the gap, to heal the wounds of the division between Christianity and Judaism, and show that the borders are much more fluid and elastic than they were considered to be. There's a sense of mission, not only in the sense of trying to reach the Jews, but an historical mission of healing the wounds and creating something mutual. I do not, unlike many others, I do not see evangelical missions as an attempt to smug Judaism, annihilate Judaism, bring Jews to abandon the traditions of their mothers and that is not a case. I mean, it's not exactly that. It's not the case. And I think those people deserve a certain credit, a certain respect that isn't always there. They don't, from their perspective for sure, they are friends, they're lovers, they're appreciators, they're embracers. Whether you choose this option or not is something different. It's up to you to consider what kind of Judaism you want to celebrate and what kind of Judaism you consider to be the one that for you is a continuation of your authentic continuation of your tradition. But I don't believe in the term of authentic, because we live in a very dynamic, as you have said it, very dynamic, very variegated, very diverse, very creative environment, religious environment, spiritual environment, social environment that creates hybridities. This is particularly religion in America. Messianic Judaism, in the way we encounter it, is an American invention of the 1970s, coming out of the counterculture, and its attempt to create all sorts of hybridities, including a Jewish intellectual and spiritual leader, Sufi Sam Lewis, who created Sufism for non-Muslims. Later on, Jews would imitate him and would create Kabbalah without the need to be in any way Jewish and to observe Jewish traditions. And so...
We're going to have to let Yossi leave. We've run out of time. What a wonderful conversation. I know we could go on and on. I have to thank you both very much. It's been a huge honor and a pleasure to speak with you both. Thank you so much.
Truly a pleasure. Truly a
pleasure. And Yossi, this is true about you, Philip. This is true about you, Yossi. You're two people I want to meet, talk to, and be in conversation with.
Very much so.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully soon in person.
Please be healthy. Please be safe. All the best to both of you.
Take care.
Take care.
All the best.